Okay, so are you ready to dive into some seriously thought-provoking stuff?
Always up for a good mental workout.
Well, today's deep dive is into Cheikh Anta Diop's The African Origin of Civilization, you know?
Myth or reality?
Right, myth or reality. The subtitle really grabs you, and just looking at the cover, it's striking, even before you open it.
It challenges so much of what we're usually presented with, even visually.
And you've brought some excerpts, images of ancient Egyptian artifacts,
And to give
sculptures.
a visual sense, too, yeah.
Yeah.
Because those images often contradict the typical portrayals, right?
Right off the bat, you start questioning things.
Exactly.
So our mission, if you will, is to really get into Diop's central argument, which is that ancient Egyptian civilization, the one we're always told was the cradle of civilization,
Right.
was actually of Black African origin.
And the big question Diop asks is how that's been obscured, misinterpreted throughout history.
And he jumps right in, doesn't he? He starts by tackling Herodotus.
The so-called father of history.
If Herodotus is supposed to be the authority, then what does it mean when Diop finds all these inconsistencies in his descriptions of the Egyptians?
Especially regarding their race.
Exactly. It's like, wait, if the foundation is shaky, what does that say about the whole structure?
Diop uses Herodotus's own words against him, which is fascinating. I mean, Herodotus does acknowledge the Black African features of the Egyptians.
He sees it, right?
He sees it, but then he makes these claims that they must have been colonists from Colchis, a region on the Black Sea. It's like he can't reconcile what he's seeing with the prevailing beliefs of his time.
It's like, well, they look like this, but they couldn't possibly be that.
Yeah, that cognitive dissonance is all over the place when you start looking at these historical accounts.
Diop is basically saying, look, even the father of history has his biases. But he doesn't stop there, does he?
No, he goes right for another big one, the Bible.
Oh.
Specifically, the story of the curse of Ham.
The one where Noah's son sees him naked and boom, all his descendants are cursed with black skin.
And then conveniently used to justify the enslavement of Africans.
It always felt, I don't know, a bit flimsy to me as an explanation.
Well, Diop breaks it down, and it's brilliant. He shows how there's actually nothing in the original text linking Ham's descendants to black skin or designating them as this cursed race.
So it's an interpretation that came later.
Much later. And it was a way to justify the transatlantic slave trade.
So basically twisting scripture to fit a narrative.
A convenient narrative for those in power at the time.
Right, because if it's God's will.
Exactly. It underscores how important it is to really examine where our knowledge is coming from and to be aware of like the historical context.
When were these things written? Why were they written that way?
You can't just take things at face value.
And Diop really pushes that. He even challenges this whole concept of the Negro as this distinct racial category.
Associated with, primitiveness, intellectual inferiority.
All those awful stereotypes.
He argues it wasn't some natural or an inevitable development, but a deliberate creation by the West.
To justify colonialism.
Exactly. The exploitation of African peoples.
This whole idea that Black people were somehow inherently less than, that was manufactured.
To serve a purpose.
It's chilling when you think about it.
He meticulously traces how that myth took root, how it became entrenched in Western thought, and how it ultimately became the foundation for racist ideologies.
But Diop doesn't just rely on historical analysis, he goes to the source. He brings in these accounts from people who actually traveled to Egypt.
Those early European travelers, yeah. Like Champollion, the one who cracked the hieroglyphics.
And Volney, the French historian.
Many of them, in their initial accounts, actually acknowledged the Black African features of the ancient Egyptians.
They saw it with their own eyes. What happened?
Well, as time went on, their observations became more and more clouded by the prevailing racial biases of their time.
It's like they couldn't escape the narrative they were already living in.
It shows how even seemingly objective observations can be so easily swayed by preconceived notions.
Like Diop brings up the example of Volney, who describes Egyptians as having a black face. But then later on, he backtracks and adds this qualifier, coppery, to his description.
Pick a lane, Volney.
Exactly. It's like, dude, which is it?
Right. So then Diop hits us with the visual evidence.
Those images you brought, like those of Zoser, Ramses II, even the Sphinx.
Those images become crucial pieces of evidence. Diop meticulously analyzes their features, the shape of their skulls, the texture of their hair, even the artistic representations of skin color in those images. The evidence is undeniable.
These are people of Black African origin.
Exactly.
And the Sphinx, I mean, it seems hard to argue with that.
I mean, it has those distinctly African features, even when you compare it to how it looked when it was rediscovered in the 19th century, which we can see in those images as well.
Wow.
It's a visual representation that just directly challenges those traditional narratives.
And it's modeled after Pharaoh Khafre, right? The one who built the second pyramid at Giza.
Makes you wonder what else we've been getting wrong.
Totally. So Diop's basically dismantling this idea of a whitewashed ancient Egypt. But then the question becomes, if it wasn't Europeans or Asians who brought civilization to Egypt, where did it come from?
And this is where he gets into the debate about where Egyptian civilization began.
Some argue it originated in the Nile Delta region, right?
Which, of course, is closer to Europe.
Makes it easier to draw that line from Egypt to Europe and claim that's how civilization flowed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea was that it was brought in by invaders from the north. But Diop dismantles that pretty effectively.
How so?
Well, first of all, he points out that there's a long-standing Black African presence in the Nile Valley, going back thousands of years before any supposed invasion from the north.
So the evidence points to a southern origin.
All the evidence, yeah.
What about that idea that Libyans brought civilization to Egypt? I know they're depicted in some of the Egyptian art.
Diop's analysis of the Libyans is interesting. It's nuanced. He looks at their arrival in a specific historical context. He connects it to events like, for example, the decline of the Old Kingdom. And often they are shown as captives or subjugated people, not as this civilizing force some claim them to be.
Okay, so he's debunked the idea that civilization came from outside of Africa. But then what about within Africa? How does he make that connection?
This is where he delves into those cultural practices. And this is where things get really fascinating, because he points out that customs like circumcision and totemism,
which were deeply ingrained in ancient Egypt.
Right, are also widespread across Black Africa.
So he's suggesting this very strong cultural connection between ancient Egypt and other parts of Africa.
A continuity that can't be easily explained away by theories of separate origins.
I see. It's like these shared cultural practices are a thread running through both cultures.
It suggests this deep, long-standing connection that goes way beyond just simple geographic proximity.
And he doesn't just stop at rituals, he goes deeper. He looks at the social structures themselves.
The matriarchal systems.
Right. He focuses on the presence of these systems in both ancient Egypt and many Black African societies.
Which challenges that Eurocentric assumption that patriarchy is somehow the natural order of things.
It's a huge contrast when you look at the patriarchal structures that dominated European societies.
And he shows how matriarchy, far from being primitive, was actually a sophisticated system of social organization. It played a significant role in the development of those civilizations.
Makes you wonder how much we've missed by assuming that our way is the only way.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got Herodotus stumbling over his biases, the Bible being misinterpreted, but Diop doesn't let up. He then takes on respected scholars who he believes just got it wrong.
He really calls them out, doesn't he?
He accuses them of intentionally obscuring the African origin of Egyptian civilization.
Yeah, name some names even.
Like who?
Like Champollion and Maspero, another prominent figure in Egyptology.
It's one thing to, make a mistake, but to intentionally mislead. What evidence does he have for that?
He points to specific instances where, despite encountering clear evidence, these scholars went to great lengths to minimize, reinterpret, or completely ignore it. For instance, he brings up this bas-relief.
An ancient sculpture.
Yeah, where Champollion describes 4 distinct racial groups.
So like an ancient Egyptian lineup, and he leaves out the Black Africans.
Well, not exactly. What's interesting here is that the bas-relief actually describes the Egyptians as reddish-brown in color.
Okay, so he's addressing that reddish-brown thing head-on.
Oh, yeah. He gets into that in detail a little later.
I'm curious to hear how he unpacks that one.
But the key point here is that Champollion puts the Egyptians in the same racial category as the Nubians, who were very clearly Black Africans. But then he invents this whole other category for the Negro.
To distinguish them from the Egyptian.
Exactly. And he describes them in incredibly derogatory terms. It's like he's trying to fit square pegs into round holes.
To maintain a racial hierarchy.
Exactly. Diop calls this the falsification of history.
Where scholars, despite the evidence, manipulate their interpretations to uphold the racist ideologies that, European colonialism depended on.
It's wild how much work they had to do to avoid acknowledging the obvious.
Yeah, it's comical.
Really speaks to the power of ideology to shape even the most rigorous scholarship.
So we've got Herodotus, the Bible, Now respected scholars twisting the facts. Diop is painting a compelling but kind of unsettling picture.
He's making us rethink everything we thought we knew, and we're just getting started.
Can't wait to hear what else he digs up.
So about that reddish-brown description, remember Champollion using that term?
From that bas relief.
Yeah, that one. Well, Diop digs into the meaning of this color in the historical context.
Because our understanding of color and race is very different from how the ancient Egyptians might have seen it.
Exactly. Diop argues that reddish-brown, in the vocabulary of the ancient Egyptians, was a way to distinguish themselves from foreigners.
Not from black Africans.
Right. He even points out that Nubians, who were undoubtedly black, are sometimes described in Egyptian texts as having a red complexion.
So it's not about skin color in the modern sense, more about cultural, geographic distinctions.
It really makes you rethink how we impose our modern categories onto the past.
It's like we're trying to understand a totally different world with a different understanding of race and identity.
Right. And to further strengthen his argument, Diop brings in linguistics.
He compares the ancient Egyptian language to various black African languages.
And he finds all sorts of similarities.
Similarities, yeah.
Grammar, vocabulary, even certain sound patterns between ancient Egyptian and languages spoken in Black Africa. These linguistic connections, he argues, just provide further evidence of a shared origin.
Hard to dismiss that.
Exactly. It's not just one piece of evidence. It's this cumulative case he's building.
And he even gives specific word examples, right?
Oh, yeah. Like the Egyptian word for to ask is incredibly similar to the word for to ask in Wolof.
Wolof?
It's a language spoken in Senegal.
Huh. Interesting.
So you have these linguistic echoes combined with the cultural and physical evidence. Pretty compelling.
Like following a trail of breadcrumbs, each one leading us closer to the truth.
And then Diop takes us beyond Egypt. He traces those Egyptian cultural influences across the Mediterranean, even into Europe.
So he's not just trying to rewrite the history of Egypt, he's showing its impact on the wider world.
He's showing how it ripples outward. He highlights the worship of Isis in ancient Rome, the cultural practices of the Etruscans, even the origins of Greek philosophy as examples of Egyptian influence.
He's basically flipping the script on that whole, Europe as the center of civilization narrative.
Saying that the flow of knowledge and culture wasn't just one way.
That Africa, through Egypt, played a major role in shaping the Western world. It makes you wonder how different our understanding of history would be if we started from that premise.
And to counter that persistent narrative of Africa as somehow backward, uncivilized, he dives into those Black African civilizations themselves.
Showing their sophistication, their achievements.
He takes us on this journey through the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhay, showing their wealth, their architectural achievements, complex systems of governance.
He paints a vivid picture. He uses historical accounts like those of Ibn Battuta, who is
The Arab traveler, yeah.
to really showcase these societies.
And he really emphasizes their vibrant traditions, intellectual, artistic traditions.
He's challenging that image of Africa as this continent without history.
A continent solely defined by colonialism and slavery.
He's showing the richness, the diversity.
History is never a single story.
It's a tapestry.
Exactly.
And he doesn't shy away from some of the complexities, right? Like the influence of Arab traders, the impact of the slave trade.
He gets into those nuances. He analyzes Arab accounts of Black African kingdoms and rulers like the Tour dynasty in Ghana.
And what does he find in those accounts?
Well, it's fascinating because these narratives often reveal this mix of admiration but also prejudice.
So he's using these accounts to provide a more multifaceted view.
Exactly, to show those internal dynamics, but also the external forces that shaped these societies.
Okay, so we've seen how Diop makes a pretty compelling case for the African origin of Egyptian civilization. But where does he go from there?
Well, he doesn't stop at just rewriting history. He challenges us to consider the implications of this argument.
So how this revised understanding can shape our view of the present and even the future.
It's not just an academic exercise. It's about how we see ourselves, our place in the world.
It's personal.
Diop believed that recognizing the Black African origins of Egyptian civilization has profound implications for understanding the history of Africa, the history of the world, and even the nature of human civilization itself.
Powerful stuff.
He felt it was crucial to dismantling racist ideologies and promoting a more just, equitable world.
So it's about reclaiming agency, right? Acknowledging the contributions of Black people to world history.
And ultimately, building a future where those contributions are recognized, celebrated.
Not erased or minimized.
And it's not just about individual empowerment.
He also saw it as a way to drive social and political transformation.
He envisioned a future where people of African descent, united by that shared history, that common struggle, could work together
To overcome those legacies of colonialism and racism.
and create a more just and equitable world. It's a powerful vision.
And it requires not just acknowledging the past, but actively shaping that future.
And this is where I think Diop's work is most relevant today. It gives us that framework for understanding how interconnected our struggles are, for building solidarity across borders, across identities, and creating a world where everyone's contributions are valued.
Speaking of connections, let's go back to one specific point we touched on earlier. Those matriarchal systems
Ah, yes.
in ancient Egypt and Black Africa. It's an important thread in Diop's argument.
It's a crucial point because it directly challenges that Eurocentric assumption that patriarchy is just, the natural order. Diop points out that in both ancient Egypt and many Black African societies, women held positions of power, influence.
So, inheritance passing through the maternal line. Women in political, economic, religious leadership roles. It's a very different picture from the patriarchal structures that we see in Europe.
Exactly. And this challenges that narrative of African societies as inherently patriarchal. And it further supports his argument about that cultural continuity between ancient Egypt and Black Africa,
It's like he's constantly dismantling that Eurocentric lens.
and pushing us to embrace a more inclusive, expansive perspective.
So it's not just that he's presenting a different version of the past. He's offering a new way of seeing the world.
A world where the contributions of those who have been marginalized are finally acknowledged, celebrated.
We've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the core arguments of Cheikh Anta Diop's work. But like we said at the beginning, this deep dive is just a starting point. There's so much more to discover within his book, all those fascinating details, the analyses.
We encourage you to keep going, to delve deeper into Diop's research, explore the sources, and really embark on your own journey of discovery.
Because ultimately, Diop's work isn't just about rewriting history. It's about empowering us to think critically about the world around us, to question those assumptions, challenge those dominant narratives, and reclaim our agency. As knowledge producers, as history makers.
He's given us the tools to dismantle the master's house. Now it's up to us to build our own.
So we've heard the arguments, we've seen the evidence, and I think it's safe to say that we're starting to see the world through a bit of a different lens now. But the big question becomes, where do we go from here? What does this all actually mean for us, for our lives?
That's the real challenge, right? Moving from understanding to action. Diop's work is all about empowerment. He really believed that this knowledge, this understanding of the African origin of civilization should empower people of African descent
To see themselves differently.
to recognize their contributions to world civilization.
Yeah.
And to challenge the systems that continue to marginalize them.
So it's not just about personal pride, it's about collective action. Building a future where, the narrative of Africa isn't defined by colonialism or slavery.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming that agency, both individually and collectively, and shaping a world that reflects the richness, the complexity of African history and culture.
And he really saw this knowledge as a bridge, didn't he, between Africa and the African diaspora.
Absolutely. Understanding those shared roots, he believed, could foster solidarity, lead to more
A
collaboration.
more unified, powerful African world.
He really envisioned a world where those connections, those shared experiences, could be harnessed to create a force for positive change, for social justice, and a future where all people of African descent could thrive. It's a powerful vision, and it requires us to think beyond borders, beyond national identities, to embrace a broader sense of, belonging and shared purpose.
So what Diop's offering is a roadmap for transformation. Understanding the past, challenging the present, and actively shaping a future where those legacies of oppression are dismantled and replaced with this vision of justice, equity. But that can feel kind of overwhelming. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think it starts with that critical lens that Diop keeps encouraging us to develop. Question the narratives that you encounter, the stories you've been told, about history, about Africa, even about yourself.
Dig deeper.
Seek out those alternative perspectives, and don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Don't just accept what you're given.
Become an active participant in creating knowledge.
Not just a passive consumer of pre-packaged narrative.
Right.
And use that knowledge to create change. Build bridges, amplify those marginalized voices, advocate for that more just and equitable world.
Diop reminds us that history isn't static. It's this dynamic, evolving narrative
And we all have a role to play in shaping that narrative.
in making sure it reflects the full spectrum of human experience and possibility.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Diop's work, we invite you to continue that journey. Explore the sources, engage in the debates, and really challenge yourself to see the world with fresh eyes.
Because the power of Diop's work lies not just in the knowledge, but in that potential it unlocks for transformation, individual, collective, and global.
History isn't just something we learn about, it's something that we create. So what will your contribution to that story be?